All right, well, welcome again. After a week or so off, we're back to class again. This is Old Testament Survey 3. This is lesson number 3. And we're going to be continuing on and looking at the books of the writings. We'll be looking at, see if this thing works this time. Yes, yay. All the technology works for a change. We'll be looking at Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job in this particular lesson. We'll just kind of take a quick look at the outline just to kind of see where we are. We're at lesson 3 in the poetical books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. Last week we were supposed to be doing Psalms and Song of Solomon, but there was a problem at Shannon's, so we had to go online, and it hadn't gotten posted yet. So that'll be up within the next week. So we'll have there's Psalms was something I think kind of special. I had a few ideas on things I wanted to do, and the geek in me kind of took over and got a little bit lost in the details. So that one will be coming, in case you've been hunting for it and wondering, I don't see it. Well, it's because I didn't get it there. So I ask for your forgiveness on that one. Okay, so the 3 books we're looking at with the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. Again, it's continuation of the poetic books. These are all part of the poetic type writings. We talked about the different types of writings. They had the poetic and then the lyrical and some of those things. So this is the ones we look at now. Proverbs. This basically is you try to little chart here to kind of give it a quick summary for each of the books. You got Proverbs is call it like guidelines for living. Pretty much all these nice little sayings that you can use to kind of give some general guidance for how to live your life. Lots of those things, and of course, this is a word that's kind of gotten into our entire terminology because you often say, "Oh, this, the proverbial this or the proverbial that." Well, this is where that comes from. Coming from the work, we're in Proverbs. Ecclesiastes, now that one we kind of summarize that by saying it's how to live a satisfying life by following God and not by pursuing material wealth or personal desires. Ecclesiastes was completely written by Solomon. Proverbs, the majority was written by Solomon. And we'll take a look in a minute at kind of the contrast between these things. And then we get to the book of Job, and that summarizes as faithfulness through suffering. Job, was faithful to almost, beyond belief for all the things that happened to him, and as faithful as he was. Okay, so we'll start right into the books here real quick. Okay, Proverbs, like I said, we're calling it kind of a collection of wisdom. King Solomon, he kind of personified wisdom both in his life and in the words he wrote. I mean, in his life, at least at the early part, he was smart enough and wise enough to ask for wisdom, and so God granted him that. So he was considered the wisest person that ever lived. And people were coming from all around to seek his wisdom. And as he wrote down these things that he put, his little lessons for life, he put all his wisdom and tried to put it down so he could share it with others. And then, as we'll see, and I think it's mostly in your text there, I'm not going to go too deep into a lot of the number details because, that's boring enough to read once and to hear it twice. I could probably only make it more boring. But all the numbers, he wrote some of it, but he also collected bits. So it was like, he was also wise enough to know that he didn't know it all. So he collected bits of wisdom from others. And so part of what we see in Proverbs is the bits that he collected and then wrote them down. And then in actuality, then there was, another author, and then one that, was it Lemuel or whatever, that they're not really sure who that was. They think it probably was Solomon using an alias, but not real sure. But the whole thing really wasn't brought together until Hezekiah's time, when they really brought all this all into like one big collection. So it's It's from Solomon's time, but it didn't really get put into one source until later. But we can look at this basically as, sage advice from the wisest man ever, other than when Jesus himself was walking the planet. But as far as, a person that's just human and not human and God at the same time, this was the wisest, pure human.
What does sage advice mean?
Just,
Sage advice from the wisest man ever. Sage to me is an herb.
yeah, they just use that. It's another, another term that they use for wisdom. Yeah, wise person. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's not like sage was it parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme? No, different type.
I'm sorry.
Different.
I wasn't trying to be flip.
No. I'm just
Makes sense to me.
no. But it's and you hear about somebody that you actually be referred to a person as a sage sometime, as a wise man. So okay, so anyhow, it's it's advice. It's not like the law in the we got in the Torah, where it is these aren't the was it 350 commandments. These are bits and pieces of advice. They're not law. It's not things that you have to follow. It's advice that if you follow it, you're pretty much likely to have things go pretty well for you. But it's not law. I mean, some people I think try to take these proverbs and say, okay, we're going to take all these and we're going to make these into laws that you must follow. A lot of the the folks that are real picky about things and really driven by you have to have this list and that list and draw yeah, but and the ones that are kind of the holier than thou types and you have to follow this or else you're not a true believer. A lot of them will try to do that.
You said that, and I just thought of one of the scriptures in Proverbs that was talking about eating the dog's vomit.
Yeah.
I mean, that they would,
Yeah.
that someone would want the Proverbs to be the rule and laws for us.
Mm-hmm.
Because that doesn't make sense, because not all of they were.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's also it's not like the word that the prophets got that we just studied last time. Whereas this is a word directly from God as to this is what you should be doing. But
Proverbs came from a man's.
well, they're still guided by God.
Right.
But it's as we see, it's basically guidance for everyday life. It's kind of a best practices type thing. But like anything that's not directly law from God, these can have exceptions. This is like most likely going to work out, but there could be times when it doesn't. So that's where you have to have a little wisdom yourself when you look at these and say, does this apply to this situation? More than likely, yes, but there could be exceptions. Now, one of the things I found it kind of interesting was that it was said that there was quite a possibility that at least some of the earlier ones that he wrote and maybe some of the ones he collected, he might have actually used in his court to give instructions to the young members of his court as to how they should be living and how they should be doing their tasks and etc. And that kind of led me to a little light bulb going off today as I was putting this down. So I've got kind of an exercise I'd kind of like you guys to try over the next time, since we got several weeks that are going to be between this and our next meeting. Now theoretically, you've already read Proverbs according to the reading plan, but if you get a chance, go back and reread it or reread portions of it, and just imagine yourself sitting in Solomon's court, and instead of you reading these, imagine yourself there listening to Solomon himself giving this. Kind of just put yourself in that situation and see if maybe it makes it a little different for the way you take your take on this and how it sinks in. Because you think about it, if you imagine yourself, you're sitting there listening, again to the wisest man that was ever around. And I haven't even tried this yet because I just thought of it just as I was making up these slides. So I think it's going to be interesting to try just to go back and, try to put your imagination in, you're sitting there listening to Solomon himself give you this instead of reading it, a long, long time later. Okay, one of the things you really see in Proverbs is this Hebrew parallelism that I kind of mentioned back in the first class when we were talking about the general types of things where they have this Hebrew poetry being considerably different than what we consider poetry. We're more into, the meter and the rhyming, and they have a lot thing where they have this parallelism where they'll have two verses that will be, as we'll see here, there are different ways they do it, but one kind of reinforces or follows the other. That's the way they do it. So this was straight out of your book, but I thought it was worth looking at. So you've got the ones that are synonymous, where the first line is repeated basically for the second one, just for an emphasis. And their example here is Proverbs 1:5, where it says, "A wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel." So it's saying the same thing, but just slightly differently. Then you've got antithetically, where the first line is contrasted in the second line. Here we go to verse 7, where it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." So first you're talking about somebody being, wise, and then you contrast that with a fool. And then there's synthetically, the first line expands in the second line. And this is Proverbs 1:4, where it says, to give prudence to the simple, to take the young man knowledge and discretion. So it just kind of expands on it. It says, okay, you take this, and then this expands on it a little bit more. You give prudence to the simple, but then, the young man, you can give knowledge and discretion. And you'll see this pretty much in the Proverbs, the way that they do it. It's, one verse will be followed by the second one that meets one of these particular patterns. You can either repeat it, go, contrast it to give the meaning by saying the opposite thing, or expand upon it a bit. So that's, as you're maybe this is the case, where you're reading it more so than when you're trying to imagine yourself sitting in Solomon's court, because there you kind of want to concentrate exactly on what he's saying, but maybe, you just take a look at a few and see if you can spot some of these, because it's something that Hebrew uses a lot. It's one of their big things, even in the books that aren't considered completely poetic. You'll see it in some of those where they'll repeat this type of pattern. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Ecclesiastes. This is basically Reflections on Life by Solomon. Now, this was kind of an interesting thing because this is now later in his life. Here he contrasts life with God and without God. You can kind of see him, how he's been at one stage, he's been through another, and now he's kind of reflecting on his whole life. Gives a lot of warnings in this one about the lure of material goods and material wealth and personal pleasure. A lot of warnings in this particular part of it. And then he provides a conclusion about what makes a satisfying life. And what strikes me about this is the contrast you see between Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. In Proverbs, especially the parts that he wrote early on, that was written when Solomon was really walking with God, and he was enjoying the fruits of the wisdom that God had granted him. And things were going really well for him. I mean, people were coming from all around the known world to talk to him, to see how he was doing things. The way he was living his life according to following God, that attracted a lot of people to him for that advice, to find out what he had. But then, as we found out, last semester, as time went on, he started falling away and going, to things that were causing him to get further and further away from God, and concentrating more on all the things he had, or all his wives and concubines, and that led him off to worshiping idols. And he got to the point where he was realizing at this point now that he's writing Ecclesiastes that, wow, I've got all of this wealth, I've got all this power, but it's not satisfying me. It's just not a real satisfying life at this point. So big contrast, from really being at the top of the thing. He was in addition to be the wisest, he's also, they said, the wealthiest at the time, and probably, he tried to convert his wealth into current dollars. He might, take anybody off the Forbes 500 and make them look like paupers. Kind of hard to imagine when you look at the numbers for some of the folks on those lists, but he was pretty well off. And when it wasn't the big focus of his thing, it was, it was there, but it wasn't the big thing. But then when it became more and more of a focus, it became less satisfying. So that kind of makes you wonder, how does a guy like Solomon, go from being the wealthiest and the wisest to kind of being down in the dumps and thinking his whole life was vanity and not really worth much? How does that happen? And as that, something that happens to a lot of us also too. Very, very big contrast between those books, and if you really stop and look at them and realize that they're written by the same person, at least a good portion, most of Proverbs, all of Ecclesiastes, just to keep it official there. But yeah, the general conclusion is this was right towards the end of his life that he was writing all of this because he'd strayed away from God with all these idol worships and all that, and things just weren't satisfying him anymore like it did when he was younger, because he was not. Yeah, this is his reflections, and at the end, basically, the conclusion that he comes to is, no matter how much you've got, if you don't have God, you've got nothing. That's his basic conclusion. And again, that's kind of the wisest guy, maybe stopping and realizing. The other thing I thought of is, okay, what happened? Did he just not pay attention to all his own advice that he wrote down in Proverbs? Okay, now we move on to Job. We call this, faithfulness during suffering. Okay, one of the things that always comes up when you look at Job is, what's the source of the suffering? And the first one I'm going to put up there is, most of the time it's our own bad choices. Sometimes it's bad choices by others. Occasionally it might be as a test or a learning exercise that God has for you. But you can't always blame it on Satan like a lot of people want to do. In this case, Satan came to God and said, hey, look at this guy. He's praising you, but he's got everything. Why wouldn't he praise you? Anybody would do that. Why don't you just take it away from him? And, he'll be like anybody else and he'll curse you, and, that'll be it. So that was Job is kind of an exception. I mean, not every time. Most of us aren't good enough to have Satan go to God and say, hey, take everything away from him. And, so we can get ourselves into trouble pretty much on our own without Satan having to be a lot of help. And a lot of times it's just because we live, in a broken world, and other people make bad choices, and that brings suffering to us. So it's not always, a test. A lot of people will still want to say, it's a test. And you're going through this because it's a test. Not necessarily. It could be a test, but it's not because it was supposed to be a test. Because testing is like, okay, you made this bad decision. Now, are you going to trust God to get you out of it, or are you going to dig yourself deeper? And then again, a lot of people will always want to blame it on Satan. And then, of course, as in the case of Job's friends, and they're saying, well, this has happened because you're such a nasty sinner. It must have been some sin that you haven't confessed that's causing you to have all this going on. And you see that, going through even, when Jesus was around, when he was healing, he said, well, what sin did that guy do that caused him to have that thing that you have to now heal? And in that case, Jesus said, no, it's just, he was like that so I could show who I really am. The other thing about Job is, of course, dealing with suffering. Now, this is something that, because of the ministry that we're involved in, you see a lot of. And you have to deal with it every week, pretty much, and how to deal with it. And the big thing there is call on God. Get that, for you and for the person that's doing the suffering. Because that's really, Job pretty much had a kind of an ongoing conversation. Wasn't always the best conversation at times, but he was pretty much always talking some way, to God about it. And don't be afraid to tell God how you feel, and relay that to the people that you're trying to help too. God's big enough to take it. If you look at the Psalms, a lot of that is, them crying out and kind of giving God an earful before they finally come around to say, okay, God, I've vented my spleen, and now I'm getting back to my senses a little bit. Can you, help me out of this? And, I recognize that you are the one in charge, and I just need your help to get me out of this. And that's kind of what's going on here too. So you have to ask, for his solution, and then remember to listen for his response. That's one of the biggies. It's a problem I have quite often is I get so busy, saying, okay, help me, and I know you're the one in charge, but then I say, okay, on to the next problem, and don't stop and be still and listen for the answer. And as again, we're talking about, as we're helping others, the ministry of presence, that's basically just the ministry of being there. Sometimes that's the best thing that you can do. I remember Kay Warren, talking about when she was over in India, there was a lady there that was dying. The lady spoke no English. Kay didn't speak any Hindi. But she said just because, she was there, she could tell that this woman's, her attitude changed just because there was somebody there paying attention to her. Just because she finally felt that somebody really cared. Whereas a lot of people, especially again, and because of the ministry that we're in, a lot of these people feel like they've been completely forgotten by everybody. They might be, even their family has kind of abandoned them. And so a lot of times just being there and paying attention to them is the biggest thing they need. And kind of if you look, in the story, Job's friends were doing pretty good for a while because they were basically just sitting with him and not saying anything. It wasn't until they opened their mouth that they got themselves in trouble. The big thing is now, especially, this is for us guys, because guys tend to want to fix things. You don't always have to fix it. A lot of times people just want, a little bit of sympathy. Just to know that, you're there to listen and, you kind of understand what they're going through. They're not necessarily looking for you to fix it. Now, if they ask you, do what you can. But guys have a tendency to want to jump right in and, okay, here's the problem, here's the fixture, and they don't even listen to what the person's saying. It's like, okay, I heard your problem, now here's the solution. Why are you still talking?
A lot of times, with my communication with other people, especially when I'm in a place where, I guess I'll call it a dark place, when I have problems and stuff, I try and start my conversation by, I don't need you to fix my problems, but I just really need to talk about it, because a lot of times what happens when I'm talking and I'm hearing myself talk, then I can start hearing and understanding what God's trying to tell me. And so they're part of that, not only just realizing that we don't have to fix what's going on with our clients,
Right.
but to listen is the most important, because they're talking, they're getting these things out, and it's at times they're also able to figure out, okay, hey, I just heard that. This is going to be my next step.
Right.
And yes, men are that
Yeah.
way, but anybody who's got a caregiver's heart,
Right.
servant's heart, they're just as guilty as men. I know that in years gone by, I did the same thing. You told me, okay, well, I don't have the money for my rent, and you kept talking, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, what can I do? And not hearing like what you said.
Yeah. Yeah, I run into this even, in my engineering that, a lot of times if I just have somebody to, I've been running against a problem, and if I just have somebody that I can say, okay, here's the description of the problem, this is what I've done, and just by having somebody there to bounce it off of is like you say, it's like, oh, yeah, if I did it this, it would, So just having somebody to listen to often is really all that's needed. So, give them support and listen. That's the big thing. And then I just happened to pick up this proverb. It says, when words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent. Might have been good if, Job's friends had seen that one. Of course, if you look at most of the timelines, Job is considered to be the oldest book, possibly. So this happened long before Proverbs were available to them, but it would have been good if they'd have had that. Okay. Now, I want to do something a little bit different here. We're a little bit short on time, but we'll maybe give it a quick thing here. For the people online, I guess this part you kind of have to do on your own a little bit, but I do have an assignment for outside of class, because one of the things we're supposed to be doing here, and I know Paul's mentioned it a couple times, just since I've been around, is that the idea of these classes are that we're here to train the trainers. You guys are going to go out and train the other people in the ministry to do some of these things. So what I would like you to do is, since we've got several weeks before we meet again, go out and discuss how Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job apply to your ministry. Because everything here, the wisdom of Proverbs, the kind of the hopelessness you see a little bit in Ecclesiastes, and it definitely, the suffering of Job, those all apply to what we see in the motel ministry. And this is something that, is being done all the time. And so as you guys go out and do this, just pick a couple of the people that you serve with and talk to them about this and see, how they think some of this applies. And then, have a discussion, with what you've learned from reading through this, and just see how you can kind of convey some of the ideas to them. And then, if we have time when we come back, in 3 or 4 weeks, whatever it is, we might spend just a little bit of the first part of that next session for you guys to just kind of tell, what might have happened. Now, if you get some really good, response, somebody comes up with a really good one, email it and we'll let everybody else know ahead of time, just, so everybody can see it. It's also kind of a way that we might get some of the online people a little bit more involved too, if they can, report some of this back, and, we can then hear what's going on in their lives too, so that they're not completely, out there in the ozone somewhere, that we know they're out there, and they're part of our class, but it'd be nice to kind of hear from them occasionally too. And then we can, feedback and say, hey, that was a great thing, that happened, you brought up by talking to the people you were working with. So it's a way to do that. So for our just real quick discussion time here, let's just kind of kick around some ideas as to how you think this might apply to what you're doing, and how you can take these lessons and apply it in the motel ministry. Hopefully my mic's sensitive enough to pick it up. So
my first response would be, especially realizing and recognizing the book of Job. Through no fault of his own, he didn't really do anything, and and God allowed Satan to devastate and destroy him. God allowed Satan to bring him all the way down to nothing. When I think about that and all the suffering he went through, there are a lot of our clients, the people that we love in the motels. Not everybody is a drug addict or a mentally ill person. There are families that are there that, because one job was lost, one income was lost, someone passed away, and showing, and trying to help them understand that, through all of this suffering, that God can bring and will bring them to a better place. It may not be tomorrow, and it may even be a better motel next week or whatever, but, so anyways, Joe popped into my head.
Yeah.
I can't comment on that.
I was thinking, today we talked about choices. How Joseph had a couple choices to make when he found that Mary was pregnant. What are some things we can learn as far as the things that Proverbs talks about, wisdom, and how can you honor God by your choices? And so a lot of these folks are in that place where they have to make some pretty hardcore decisions by giving them some examples of how they can seek counsel, how they can talk amongst themselves, connecting each other to help them get through some of these times. That can also be something we'll focus on as well.
Good. Anybody else have any thoughts on how this might apply, or maybe even an example you've seen it already working? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just, from when I've been out there, I see, like you're saying, a lot of people out there that, it's just one bad thing has happened, not necessarily their own fault, and they end up in this situation, and they get kind of down because, they don't like the situation they're in, and they don't like the way that a lot of people assume that because of where they are, that they are, drug addicts or, some other problem, and even the ones that are that have been on drugs, a lot of them are, they're struggling. They know they've made a bad choice, but they want to get better, and we have to give them the hope that you can see, in Job, that, what was his famous one in there, yea though he slay me, yet will I praise him. He didn't do what his wife said. Why don't you just curse God and die? Again, that's when we're talking about the support part, that's not a good support.
I'm gonna talk to her and Eve when I get to heaven. Bad woman number 2.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's just like, and like you were saying, Stu, with the, Proverbs. It's a source of guidance for living. So we can kind of refer them to that. As to, here's some ways to, why don't you go read Proverbs? I mean, a lot of people say, well, why don't you just take read one proverb, chapter of Proverbs a day, type thing, just to get to get a plan to get through it and see what's going on, and take those those bits of wisdom and see if then you can start applying them, and then realize that you can even show them how other people in the Bible, once they've started following God's plan, they've come from dark places, really bad places, to being in really good places, and their life has meaning again. And even Solomon, at the end there of Ecclesiastes, he kind of came to the conclusion, that without God, life has no meaning. And so that's where I think that's where we can really use some of this. So, okay, well, this is kind of like my first experiment with doing a group discussion thing. I think that's something I want to do a little bit more in the future, but just to get the idea out here, and then go out and, like I say, pick a couple of the people you work with, kind of explain to them a little bit of what you've learned, from your readings in the book and reading the books themselves, and then just see what their take is on that, and again, apply. So we are training the trainers, and then you guys train some more trainers, and then eventually this thing gets really big.
I like the idea of what you're talking about, opening up more discussions between those of us who serve, with the other volunteers and stuff, because something that sometimes I notice when I come onto a site is the volunteers are there, they can't wait to volunteer, they can't wait to, serve, do the tasks, but getting them to open up and talk to the people, and I think that, an egg sandwich is one thing, but you know what, a hug and a some words of promise and hope go a lot, go a lot further. So by us learning to communicate more with each other, we can help give them, a sense of, strength and courage to be able to go up and say, hey, how's your food going? Instead of, do you want another meal?
Right.
And offering the milk, of course, is important. Right. But, I know for me, a lot of times when I'm leading, a motel church, sometimes I kind of get sidetracked. I forget that I'm leading because, I'll start talking to the residents. You know, and I'll, you know, and I'll start praying with them, and I forget, oops, I'm supposed to make sure somebody was
Right.
doing the eggs or whatever.
Right. Now, when I was leading some of the ones, you know, getting some of them started, I had kind of the opposite problem. I got so focused on trying to make sure everything got done that I forgot why I was there in the first place.
You and me would make a great team.
Yeah.
We could go to the same side. I do the talking, and you do the organizing.
And then, you know, it was like, wait a minute, you know, there's somebody over here, you know, I look in the corner, there's somebody there standing there waiting to talk to me. And it's like, you know, okay, I got to quit focusing on, you know, getting the chair set up and go talk to that person. Because that's, you know, why we're there. And a lot of times that was, you know, I'd run into that.
Everybody who serves in this ministry at one point or another goes through a Mary and Martha experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I like that example.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know, gosh,
Yeah.
I've been doing this maybe 3 or 4 years, and then just recently, probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago, got into the leadership side of it. But I know initially I really struggled with that. And I was always the Martha, you know, always the Martha. And then he just had this revelation, and it was like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Yeah.
Now I know why I'm here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because, you know, and then as you lead a little bit more, you start seeing when you do have the volunteers that are the type that really like to go out there and talk to the people, you start seeing what's happening, and you're like, yeah, I need to be part of that. You know, the eggs will take care of themselves. You know, it's the people that we're here to take care of. I mean, we actually had a case, you know, where just a little bit of talking, I found out that one of the people that was there with the band had a situation that was something we were talking about, and then found out that there was a person there that was facing a very similar situation. So got those two talking, and it turned out we prevented a suicide. So just doing things like that is something, you know, that if you don't pay attention to what's going on, you're going to miss the opportunities to really help the people.
Well, another thing in topic is that, you know, when Stu was there, he started this atmosphere of, you know, sitting around the kitchen table, and he would give a message, and then he moved on to another site. And so for the first couple of weeks there, we just had fellowship. So as volunteers would come in, it was, you know, to set up the food, it took 2 minutes, but the rest of the time was just spent in fellowshipping.
Yeah.
People who came for
Mm-hmm.
a meal or a hug or
Right.
a smile, whatever.
Yep.
And, you know, even just this past Saturday, you know, we had one of those just strictly fellowship days, and I could tell the volunteer who was there, this was something that she was really connecting with, and it was just nice.
Mm-hmm.
Because some volunteers, you get in there and, you know, they're so removed from what it is that they're actually doing. So
Right.
to see that connection being made, it was really.
Mm-hmm. And then as, you know, as you get further into the process, you know, for the motel church, you start getting some of the people, you know, that have been coming just to get the food and listen to the message. They start showing up to help with the setup and the thing. Then they start doing these things, and that's how we get it to the point that then we can turn things over to them eventually. You know, we step away, and it's now their church. But you get them going on it, and they start seeing how things are done. And not only, you know, does it help, you know, because then the people that are coming say, hey, wait a minute, this is one of us doing this. It gives then it gives them, and it helps it just build the whole thing.
What else did Steve, you know, God,
Yeah.
he's that guy, and him and I used to hustle and slam together, and
Yeah.
now he's serving, hey, God can use me.
Right.
You know, and I think that's huge, that's huge.
Yeah.
Someone is, and you know, because we do have not just the band, box. And that's one of the toughest things to overcome, is that feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. Because you just feel like nothing that I have, there's nothing that I have that's any good, and and so therefore I'm no good.
Right.
And so when I see somebody who has been clean for 6 months and who's emptying out, setting up tables or whatever, and then there's somebody else who's still struggling with the addiction, saying, check out Joe, man.
Yeah.
Joe ain't gotten high for a while, and look at what he's doing, and and I can be a part of that.
Yeah.
It's more important to bring people in close than it is for us to stand on the outside.
Right.
Saying, okay, this is what we want you to do. We're standing,
Yeah, I was just thinking of a time, one of the motels that I was at the time, we had a bunch of high school students, junior and senior high school, from a Catholic high school had come in to help. And the members there, our regular guests, kind of saw all these kids there. And one of the guys who had, he gave his testimony. He said, I should have still been in prison for what I did, but somehow I got out. And I just want to share, there was this very spontaneous testimony. It wasn't planned as part of the message for that day, but he just stood up and said, I've just got to share with you young guys so you don't do what I did. And that then triggered like 2 or 3 other spontaneous testimonies, because these people were saying, hey, here's some young people that I can maybe have an influence on so that they don't make the same mistakes I did. And that's wisdom. If you can learn from others' mistakes instead of making them yourself. Okay, I guess now we'd better cut it off for now so we don't take up all of Paul's time. So again, 3 weeks we're off, and then we'll be back, and we'll get you some more details online once we find out where we're meeting and etc.